Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I, too, will be voting in favor. I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation. And I don't want to over-stress everyone with speaking about it, but some of you may have noticed that I wear a little pin under my House Republican button that is the Hebrew word for remember. And I got that at a Holocaust commemoration a couple of years ago when the guest speaker was from Southbury. And she was a survivor from Vienna. And this pin gives me the opportunity, when people notice it, and they ask me, what's that for? I get to talk to them a little bit about the Holocaust. So I think that this piece of legislation is very important and very worthwhile. I think the chair of the Education Committee alluded to the fact that it didn't end in 1945. We've had mass murders. We don't call them genocides. Governments don't want to call them genocides, because then if you do that under the UN Charter, you actually have to do something. So we call them other things, except in Darfur. That's the only one that's been identified as a genocide. But the Hutus in Burundi, the Tutsis in Rwanda, the people in East Pakistan at the hands of the West Pak Army, all over the world. If there's unfortunately one thing that seems to help define us as humans, it's our ability to be so inhuman towards our fellow humans. And then what's sad is that so many people have forgotten so much or never learned what happened. And I'm hoping that this piece of legislation will take us a step in that direction, the right direction, of people being more sensitive and aware and conscious. The other thing was that there was mention made of the marginalized. One of the things that distinguishes the Holocaust from some of the earlier and even subsequent mass murders is that the Jewish population in Germany wasn't really marginalized. They were well assimilated. There were Jewish prime minister or foreign ministers and high-level government officials, and there was not that sense of being the other. There was always a little bit of anti-Semitism, the social put-downs and that sort of thing, but Jews were almost as well integrated into German society. There were lots of Jews who won Iron Crosses in the First World War and were officers in the German army. Now, they never got to be generals, but they were captains and majors. What happened in Germany, the Holocaust, is something, unfortunately, very distinct, something kind of new, I think, from having read maybe too much about that period of history, that you can take a population that no one would really notice as being different, and then suddenly start to say, they are different from us. They're the enemy, they're the cause of all your problems, and just identify that population, and you can turn neighbor against neighbor, boss against employer, employer against boss, teacher against student, student against teacher, with propaganda about something that is ultimately non-existent, which isn't that there is a Jewish religion, because that does exist, but against a Jewish race, because race is an entirely artificial construct. And to convince people that there is a thing called a Jewish race, and then use that as the basis for committing the mass murders, the genocides that occurred. And this is something, that is, to me, perhaps the most disquieting thing about the Holocaust, and what should disquiet everyone, is that each and every one of us could become the next set of victims, depending on what kind of government decides to take over and use that for its political purposes. And so it's, I think, very important to educate people not only about how many people died, but how that government took power through somewhat or largely democratic means and used systems of government that had been functioning, used emergency powers to establish a dictatorship, and then used propaganda to convince people of something they didn't believe when it started, but within a few years were able to convince them to commit mass murder and to believe that what they were doing was right, without even much of a sense of guilt for the most part. And that's something distinct about the Holocaust, I think. Because we see this happen in other parts of the world, but it happens to where there's a group of people who speak a different language, a group of people who worship a different religion. Not to be justified at all, but something here was really remarkable, an accomplishment, a horrible accomplishment, to take a group of people that were indistinguishable, or virtually indistinguishable from anyone else, and then mark them, and then murder them. And to the extent that we can make people aware of that potential process, I think it's important, especially in a world where we still have thousands of nuclear weapons lying around. Thank you, Madam Speaker.